Hello, in the next few minutes I want to give you a survey of the book of Romans. This is going to give you a good picture, I think, of Romans as a whole. Of course, there's debate over, this and that, but this should give you a pretty good idea of not only the big picture of Romans, but also what at least I do when I'm surveying a book of the Bible. You can, of course, survey something smaller than a book of the Bible. You could even survey a chapter. You could survey 2 or 3 chapters, like the Sermon on the Mount. But you can survey a book as a whole, and that's what I'm going to do in this video, to survey the book of Romans. So the first thing I do when I'm surveying something is I give titles. So if I'm surveying a book, then I'm going to give a title to every chapter. Now, of course, we know that the chapter divisions are fake, as it were. They weren't part of the original writing. They were added later. But it's a good place to start to get acquainted with the content of whatever you're surveying. And it also gives you a mental map of the book. And I also throw in a sentence to give just a little bit more info than a title can give. So let's go ahead and start. Chapter 1 of Romans, here's a title. You can come up with whatever title you want. I have God's wrath revealed. So we find in Romans 1 that God's judging anger is directed towards sin, and that judgment is a-coming. And I think, of course, that Romans 1 features Gentile sins. In fact, I think he's setting up the audience a little bit. He picks some stereotypical Gentile sins like idolatry and sexual immorality. He's wanting the person who's a little too smug to say, "That's right, Paul, those Gentiles are going to fry." But he's setting us up for chapter 2. In chapter 2, we realize that God's wrath is not just on the Gentile, but on the Jew as well. Just because the Gentiles have certain sins doesn't mean that the Jews are off the hook. In fact, the Jews are just as guilty as the Gentiles. All have sinned, as we know in chapter 3, verse 23. All have sinned, that is, both Jew and Gentile have sinned, and are lacking the glory of God. So just because the Jews are circumcised, male Jews, of course, doesn't mean that they're going to escape God's wrath. So we get to chapter 3. All have sinned. Both Jew and Gentile have sinned. Christ is the only way of justification for both Jew and Gentile. So we've heard the problem. The problem is set up in the first 3 chapters-ish of Romans. And we get to the general conclusion that all have sinned. Now we get into the solution. The last part of chapter 3 begins to talk about the solution, which is the atonement provided by Christ, and of course, if we have faith. And so, chapter 4, the last part of chapter 3 and chapter 4 give us the solution to the problem. And Abraham is given as an example to justify, to substantiate the fact that we are justified by faith. Abraham was justified before he was circumcised, and he was justified on the basis of his faith. And there's an intrinsic or implicit comparison here between Abraham and us, I think. That just as Abraham was justified by faith, so also we are justified by faith. Both Jew and Gentile are justified by faith. So chapter 5, the first part of chapter 5, I think, gives the conclusion to that whole first section's argument. A general conclusion, which is basically, we now have no condemnation. We will be saved from God's wrath. God's wrath was introduced in 1:17 or 1:18, but then in 5 we realize we will be saved through Jesus Christ from God's wrath. The last part of chapter 5, of course, starts a second argument about Adam, how Jesus is the last Adam. It's kind of like having given a forensic argument, having given a law court or argument for those first 4 or 5 chapters. He now moves into as it were, narrative or eschatological argument that Adam brought on the problem and Christ brings the solution. Chapter 6 then steps back and says, so since we're justified by faith, does that mean sin is irrelevant? We could just go on sinning the way we did before? And Paul emphatically says, no, we do not go on sinning as we did before. We've been buried with Christ in baptism. We should now no longer be slaves to sin. We should now be slaves to righteousness. 7 continues that question, and of course for a Jew, the question is, well, what's the purpose of the law then? If we don't get right with God on the basis of the law, why was there a law? And Paul basically answers that the law was a an indicator of my sinfulness, and also that the law aggravated my sinfulness. But he's getting to chapter 8, which is basically that now we are free from sin by the power of the Spirit. The Spirit now makes it possible to fulfill God's expectation, which we find out in chapter 13 is love. So chapters 9 through 11 then kind of generalize this whole train of thought. They're not a distraction. They're not a digression. This is intrinsic to what he's talking about. The question that he's dealing with is, how is it that the Gentiles have been included into the people of God, and how is it that Jews who have the law are not on any better footing before God than the Gentiles are? And so he steps back in chapters 9 through 11 and deals with this question of Israel. Well, what about Israel? I mean, did God just throw them away? And basically chapter 9, which here I titled True Israel, God's word of justification has not failed with regard to Israel. It's just not all of them are true Israel. God has not chosen all of them. Now, since I'm a Wesleyan, I should point out that when we get to chapter 11, there's some serious perspective provided on this. We find out that this not being chosenness is not permanent, that those who are not true Israel in chapter 9 actually can still be saved. So I want to point that out here, lest my tulip friends get a little too cocky about chapter 9. When we get to chapter 11, I think we'll find out that those who are not elect in chapter 9 can in fact still be saved. Chapter 10, again, we quote 10:9. You know, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. We lift that verse out of context and use it to present the gospel, to present how to be saved to people. But of course, that's fine. But in the train of thought, Paul is talking about Israel. Israel's heard the message of faith, but they've rejected it. They did not have faith, as it were, which is what is required. Chapter 11, in the end, Israel will be saved. Paul basically says that God has hardened Israel at present so that the Gentiles can be saved and grafted into the tree. However, in the end, all Israel will be saved, and in fact, those Gentiles who have been grafted into the tree better be careful, because God can graft them right back out, cut them right back out. So again, you see that in context, Paul is not indicating that election or being cut off is a necessarily permanent status. Those who are cut off can be grafted in, and those who are in can be grafted out. And so, in the words of Princess Bride, you'll keep using that word election. I don't think it means what you think it means. Okay, so chapter 11. Here we get to the practical part. So we've had teaching, as it were, in 1 through 11. Now we get the preaching. And in a general statement in 12:1 and 2, Paul basically says that we should now have transformed and renewed minds. And what are those renewed minds? We're going to find out in chapters 12 through 15. So chapter 12, be at peace with everyone and love each other. That's the conclusion of all this, the logical conclusion of all this stuff we've been talking about in the first 11 chapters. Chapter 13, submit to authorities. And of course, this is the chapter where Paul says that love is the fulfillment of the law. Also says it in Galatians. Chapter 14, the weak in faith. Whatever is not of faith is sin. Chapter 14, he deals with disputable matters, issues where Christians disagree. Chapter 15, he tells about his travel plans. I plan to visit you on my way to Spain. And then chapter 16 is a letter of commendation for Phoebe, and Paul greets those he knows in Rome, if it's written to Rome. There is some debate about whether chapter 16 might actually have been meant for Ephesus. I don't know that we can prove it one way or the other. I find it a very intriguing hypothesis. How does Paul know so many people in Rome when he's never been there? And of course, some of the people in Romans 16 are associated more with Ephesus than with Rome at this point of Paul's career. But anyway, this is just a survey. So let's talk about the outline of Romans. So the first thing I do when I survey is I give titles to the chapters. Second thing I do is I outline it, and I prefer to draw it in keeping with some of the professors I had in seminary. I've talked in my classes about how ancient letters and letters in the New Testament have a pretty standard outline until you get to the letter body. So we expect any of the letters of the New Testament to have an introduction and a conclusion and a body, introduction, body, conclusion. We expect to find that that's our at least our starting expectation. And I don't think we're disappointed with any of the letters of the New Testament when we start out looking for that. Of course, Hebrews is not exactly a letter. I think it's a sermon that was mailed, so it doesn't completely follow that pattern. 1 John may have been a sermon too. It doesn't follow that pattern either. But we expect to find an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. And we also expect, in most cases, Galatians is an exception, but in most cases we expect the introduction to have two parts: a greeting, or which is called a prescript, and a thanksgiving section. And we also generally expect the conclusions of Paul to have some final remarks and then a farewell of sorts. So that's kind of the template that you should expect to find when you look at a letter. So Romans has a prescript, the first 7 verses. Now I'm going to, so the first thing I do when I'm surveying is I title. Second thing I do is I outline. Third thing I do is I ask, what are the relationships between the parts of the outline? So as I present the survey of Romans, I'm going to give you my relationships between the parts of the outline interspersed with my outline. Okay, I'm going to do them integrated in. So the first 7 verses are a prescript. So structurally speaking, there is a relationship between the prescript and what follows. And basically the prescript introduces or prepares for the letter. This is a fairly kind of weak structural pattern, but let's go ahead and try to get everything we can and be exhaustive. I also ask questions. So this is how I survey. I title the chapters, I outline it, I ask what the relationships are between the parts of the outline and ask questions. And then lastly, I look for threads and themes that go through the whole thing and ask questions. So here is an observation of the relationship between the outline. The prescript introduces and prepares. And then here are the kinds of questions. Now, these you could do better than I've done with these questions. You could have more. Generally, we talk of 4 different kinds of questions. Questions of definition, why questions, how questions, and implications of the answers to these questions for the original meaning of the letter. So here's just some questions. I won't linger much with the questions as I go through these, but so there's definitional questions. What is the content of the introduction? There are how questions. How does this material introduce the letter? How does this material prepare for what follows? There are why questions. Why does Paul introduce the letter in this way? And what are the implications for the original meaning of Romans? So that's kind of some standard questions. This is not the most significant pattern to observe, but we're trying to be exhaustive. So not only do we have a prescript, but we seem to have a concluding doxology. Doxology is a praise, poetic praise words. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. It's a doxology. The reason I have it in brackets is because there are some textual issues with the concluding doxology. Some manuscripts have it, some manuscripts don't. Some manuscripts don't have it here. Some manuscripts have it at the end of chapter 15. Some manuscripts have it at the end of chapter 14. And so it's a mess. So we're not 100% sure that concluding doxology was actually part of the original letter of Romans. But if it was, how would it relate structurally to the rest of Romans? Well, we might say that the letter concludes and generalizes. That this doxology gives us a general takeaway from the letter, and it seems to have an inclusio too, because this doxology has the idea of obedience of faith, and Romans 1 had the idea of obedience of faith. This is what an inclusio is. The beginning and the end of a section have similar themes or words. So this high doxology captures the essence of that to which the letter leads, the glory of God, and so you might say it generalizes that essence of the letter, how glorious God is. And then the phrase obedience of faith parallels the prescript. So that's what I just said, but there it is in writing. So what are some questions? Is this doxology original? You have to ask that question before you can ask any questions about it, right? Why does Paul end the letter this way? How does it conclude the letter? Why does Paul use an inclusio? blah, 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 blah. And of course, there could be many more questions. I just jotted these down somewhat quickly. Okay, so again, I'm closing in from the outside at some predictable bits and some easily identified bits. So we have a prescript at the beginning, we have a concluding doxology, then we have this letter of commendation for Phoebe in 16 and some farewell greetings. So what kinds of structural relationship exist between this and what precedes? Well, it's a pretty loose relationship. We might say it's just a kind of conclusion. And then I mentioned here Edgar Goodspeed thought it was originally sent to Ephesus. He's been dead for decades and decades and decades. Okay, so some questions. To what location was this chapter actually meant? And if it was to Rome, what does it imply about the meaning of the earlier part of the letter? I believe it's Robert Jewett who makes quite a big deal about the fact that he thinks this chapter is to Rome. He thinks that this means that Paul knows an awful lot about what's going on at Rome, and that therefore we should read chapters like 14 and 15 in the light of Paul's knowledge of things actually going there. Okay, so we have the prescript at the beginning, we have concluding doxology, we have this letter of commendation, we have the Thanksgiving section. So I mentioned that 1:1 to 14, or actually 1:1 to 15, I would say, mistake there, give us the introduction to the letter, as it were. So Thanksgiving section. Thanksgiving sections typically in letters prepare or introduce things that are going to come. So there's a preparation or introductory nature to the Thanksgiving section. These sections prepare. By the way, so you have logos argument. This is logical. Thanksgiving sections more prepare the heart for what follows, as it were. And also, ethos sets up good relationships between the author and the audience. So there is a preparation function for the Thanksgiving section that's more on the affective side and the relational side than on the cognitive side. So I came up with some questions that would relate to, how did this material prepare for what follows? Why does Paul thank God for these things, and so forth? Okay, we're closing in, aren't we? I'm still doing the front and the back of Romans. There are layers to Romans, aren't they? I haven't even gotten to the body, which is the most meaty part of Romans yet. So we not only have the introductory stuff with the letter, prescript, and Thanksgiving, we now reach the complete closingness, the complete conclusion part of Romans. So we not only have a doxology and a letter of commendation, but he has closing comments in 15, 14 to 33. These provide a conclusion. There seems to be some similarity to components in the Thanksgiving, so you might say there's a little bit of a loose inclusio between stuff in the Thanksgiving section and stuff in the concluding comments. And then here are some questions. Of course, is it an inclusio? If you aren't sure about your observations, go ahead and write a question about them. Okay, now we reach this is the full outline on its highest level. And I've just put the body of the letter there. Now, the body of the letter covers about 15 chapters, or 14 to 15 chapters. So that's so big that even though we're surveying the letter as a whole, I think it's worthwhile to at least show some subdivisions, maybe, within the letter body. In particular, there seems to be, and I already mentioned this, a logical cause-effect relationship between the first chapters 1 through 11 and the last chapters 12 through 15. There's a big therefore at 12:1. So because of if the first 11 chapters are true, then therefore live like the last 3 chapters there. So there's a logical causation between the first part and the second part. Because God has saved us from wrath, therefore live accordingly. And in particular, live above sin. Have an appropriately renewed mind. And I've already said that I think the love command generalizes the fulfillment of the law made possible by the Spirit. And so the second part tells us how to live out the appropriate life given the instruction in the first part. 12:1 and 2, although I didn't put it in my survey because it would be part of the survey of the second section of the book. 12:1 and 2 give us a general statement that plays itself out in the rest of Romans. And of course, the love command, I think, generalizes the ethical expectation that Paul repeats, kind of alludes to throughout Romans. So here are just some questions. In what way did the first 11 chapters logically lead to the next 4? 12, 13, 14, 15, yeah, okay. Why does Paul structure Romans this way? How does the love command generalize the exhortations of these chapters? How do the exhortations flow from the exposition? Etc., etc., etc. Okay, so now I went into a little bit more detail because I think, again, even though I'm getting down a few sub-levels, I think that this is significant to the whole letter, enough significant to the whole letter that it should be mentioned. So there are some thematic verses in 1:16 and 17, the key verses that are about the righteousness of God. These are played out, I believe, in these first 11 chapters. By the way, they're also thematic for the first 5 chapters for those who might be doing a survey of that in the near future. So the theme of 1:16 and 17 is played out in those 11 chapters. We say it's particularized because the general statement moves to the particulars. And it's also substantiated, meaning that Paul defends what he's saying here in those verses. Well, let me ask questions about, here's a statement of it. So basically, there's a movement from general to particular in the key verses to the rest of the book, with substantiation of the truth of those verses. This is probably the most important relationship in Romans we've seen so far, because it suggests that we should really know a lot about 1:16 and 17. So the theme of Romans is that the saving righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel, and this fact plays itself out in the entirety of the first half of the letter of Romans. Okay, so as it is played out, Paul backs up this. He substantiates it repeatedly, and he explains it as well in the things that he says. So I should have way more questions than this, but there's a few questions about that. So definition questions, how question, why question, implications. Okay, now, so I've titled the chapters, I have outlined it, I have identified relationships between the parts of the outline, and I've asked questions. Now I'm looking for themes that run throughout Romans, and I'm also going to ask questions. So, for example, actually, a lot of these recurring themes are part of the things I've already mentioned. So there's a recurring comparison between Jew and Gentile in Romans. In a sense, I've already covered it in a sense when I said that 1:16 and 17 are a general statement that play themselves out in the rest of Romans. Nevertheless, I'll name it here because I think it's helpful to name it, even though it's already kind of been included in something we've already done. The first 3 chapters especially compare Jew and Gentile, and then chapters 9 through 11 also especially deal with this question. So here's some general questions. Should have more questions than this, but there are just a few questions. Okay, now here's some more things that I think are significant enough to mention in a survey of all of Romans. So it seems that 11:33 through 36 provide a certain kind of climax to that whole first section. And because it covers so much of Romans, so if these verses climax the first 11 chapters, that's still over half of the letter. So if you talk about a 51% rule, in a survey only mention the patterns that dominate at least 51% of the content. That doesn't mean they're in 51% of the content. It means that they control, or as it were, affect at least 51%. So these verses, it's another doxology of God. These verses, I think, effectively climax the entire first section of the letter. They are a celebration of God's righteousness, a burst of worship. And again, here are some questions about that. So here is my breakdown of the letter body. And of course, if you were doing a survey of one of these sections, you might take notice, although I welcome disagreement. So we have the thematic verses in 1:16 and 17, a general statement that is played out in the rest of this section. We have a kind of problem solution in 1:18 through 5:11 with a conclusion. So 1:18 through 3:20 give us the problem, 3:21 to 4:25 give us the solution, and then 5:1 through 11 arguably give us a general conclusion. 1:18 through 5:11 is as I said, a law court perspective. It has to do with law, guilt, justification in the eyes of the law. So that's a legal perspective. Then 5:12 through 8:39 almost go back, and give another perspective on it. It's the Adam-Christ perspective. It's the narrative or story version. Sin came into the world and death through Adam. It goes out through Christ. And what was the purpose of the law in the middle? The law showed me that I was a sinner. The law showed me that I needed Christ. And so 5:12 through 21 talk about how death and condemnation came through Adam, life and justification through Christ. And then Paul follows up with some questions that might come out of that. So, for example, does this mean I can continue in sin since I'm getting a free ride? Paul says emphatically no. And of course, well, what was the deal with the Jewish law then? And Paul gives an explanation there. But then he gets to chapter 8, 1 through 39, where we have this victory proclamation. There's no condemnation, and glory is on its way. So then 9:1 through 11:36 step back a little bit and say, well, what was the whole deal with Israel? If we're being justified by faith, then what was the purpose of Israel in the first place? So this is kind of my sense of the overall flow of thought in the body of Romans. So are there some themes that dominate, like I said, 51% rule? Are there some themes that dominate Romans at least halfway? Well, it seems to me that not only do these verses 9 through 11 climax the first part of the letter, but they seem to somewhat step back and give a more general perspective on the problem. Paul draws back from the specific arguments he's been making about justification, and he addresses the Jew-Gentile issue directly. So not enough questions, but I threw a few on the Barbie. And then here's some more. There seems to be a recurring presentation, a recurring movement from problem to solution in Romans. So in 1:18 through 5:11, the problem is universal sin, and the solution is Christ's death and faith. In 5:12 through 8:39, the problem was brought by Adam's sin. The solution was brought through Christ. And then chapters 9 through 11 are dealing with the same problem and solution again from the perspective of God's promises to Israel and so forth. Well, these are not enough questions. There should be way more questions than these. But to fulfill a little bit of the form, these are some of the kinds of questions you might ask about those cause-effect relationships. Finally, I think God's grace, I think there are two more slides. God's grace and righteousness are the ultimate cause of the solution to humanity's problem. Underlying Paul's entire argument is the presumption that salvation finds its ultimate argument in the righteousness and graciousness of God. This, again, is somewhat already included in the general statement that are the key verses of Romans that we've already mentioned. And I threw some questions out there. Now, finally, the trigger, that is the immediate cause. So the more ultimate cause is the righteousness of God, but the immediate cause is faith. And so we talk about the efficient cause. Faith is the efficient cause of my justification, even though the kind of reason for it all, that level of cause, is God's righteousness. So faith that God raised Jesus from the dead, and of course trust in Christ's atoning death. And there are some questions. Well, this has not been a perfect survey of Romans, but I hope it's given you, one, a good sense of the big picture of Romans, and two, a fair sense of what at least I do when I survey a book of the Bible. Thank you.